Hello, I'm Tim Smith, and welcome to another Monuments Monday. This is the monument to the 126th New York Infantry, which was part of George Willard's brigade, which of course was part of Alexander Hayes's division of General Hancock's 2nd Army Corps. And since in this series of videos we're going to talk a lot about monuments, I wanted to mention that the average size of a regiment at Gettysburg is about 300 men. At the beginning of the war, every regiment had 1,000 men, but by the time they got to Gettysburg, and they had been in other battles and whittled down, of course, by disease in the camps, 300 is the average. This unit had about 450 men, so they were still a relatively large regiment. And they lost more than half of their men in the fighting, killed or wounded or captured. George Willard's brigade on July 2nd had been shifted off of Cemetery Ridge and down into the area near where the 1st Minnesota fought against Cadamus Wilcox's brigade, and this unit ended up fighting against General Barksdale's Mississippians. And the commander of the brigade, George Willard, was killed in that action. Now, on July 3rd, the 126th New York was here in Ziegler's Grove and actually swung out and fired into the flank of the North Carolinians and Mississippians of Davis's and Pettigrew's brigades as they swept across the field towards Cemetery Ridge. And in the fighting on July 3rd, Colonel Eliakim Sherrill was killed. He had previously been wounded at the fighting near Harper's Ferry in September 1862. And he took command of Willard's brigade after Willard had fallen on July 2nd, and his bravery and courage was called into question by General Winfield Scott Hancock as Willard's brigade retreated. And it's the opinion of many that Sherrill recklessly exposed himself on July 3rd, was shot in the bowels, ended up dying at the George Spangler House the next day. But when the veterans came back here to dedicate this monument, they wanted to highlight the colonel of their regiment who had been killed in the fighting. So here we are in front of one of the more dramatic statues on the Gettysburg National Military Park, I think. General Alexander Hayes. Now, Hayes was a veteran of the Mexican War. He graduated from West Point, and I think Ulysses S. Grant graduated a year behind him, and they were good friends in the years prior to the American Civil War. Hayes lived in Pittsburgh, or near Pittsburgh, I should say, and he commanded a division of troops here at the Battle of Gettysburg. His headquarters were actually at the Abraham Bryan farm during the battle, and he commanded the troops in Ziegler's Grove. And I mean, think about when this monument was placed, this was the entrance to the Gettysburg National Military Park, and as people came around this bend past Ziegler's Grove, this is one of the first monuments on the battlefield that they saw. And there's this dramatic story about something that Hayes did during July 3rd, just after the charge. And I will preface this by saying that I'm going to tell the story my way. And there are several little versions of the story. Mine's a little bit different, perhaps. But after the charge was over, one can only imagine the jubilation of the soldiers along this ridge, knowing that they just crushed Lee's attempt to break through the Union center. And one thing is clear from the Union soldiers, in Fredericksburg along the line to the excitement after the charge, that everyone knew that they had beat the Southerners, and this was a decisive victory in the war. Of course, you know, you could argue about whether they think it's the turning point of the American Civil War, but the Union Army had lost a lot of battles to Lee in Virginia. Alexander Hayes had his staff officers gather together, each a Confederate battle flag. And then Hayes and two of his staff rode up in front of the Union lines, dragging the Confederate battle flags and trampling the Southern dead in the fine tradition of Pittsburgh sportsmanship. Okay, well, maybe that's a little much. But the important thing to note here is that he did it. Several other officers told him, you know, to stop. But, and in the account, I should say that they did specifically mention that they went around the Confederate dead and didn't trample them. I threw that part in there too. At Gettysburg, when Longstreet's memorable charge of the 3rd of July had been repelled, and the 12 regiments of Hayes's division had captured 2,600 prisoners and 21 stands of colors, General Hayes took a rebel flag and two of his staff, each with a captured flag, rode down in front of his command, trailing the rebel colors in the dusk amid deafening shouts and cheers of the men. From the history of the 126th New York Regiment. But I tell you what, if you go to Pittsburgh today, to the Heinz History Museum, they have a painting of Alexander Hayes dragging the battle flags right next to their portrait of Mr. Rogers. So, and I have to tell you, I told the story just like that when I gave a tour of the battlefield to John Harbaugh, Jim Harbaugh, and their father Jack Harbaugh for an HBO special in which they came to Gettysburg and filmed on the battlefield. So it's one of my favorite stories to tell. And I have lots of friends from Pittsburgh, and I think they kind of like the story. One interesting thing about Alexander Hayes, of course, is that he was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness, and he's buried in Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh. I've been to his grave, and wow, what a magnificent grave. And I'll put a link in the description to a video by a Pittsburgh TV station about his gravesite. And you know, there's a story that when Ulysses S. Grant was running for president, he visited Pittsburgh and he asked to be taken to Alexander Hayes' grave. And according to the mayor of Pittsburgh, he sat on a stone and he sobbed at his good friend's grave. Now remember, if you like the historical content that we've been putting on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe.